So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We are very happy to have Nick Bloom with us today from Stanford. Hi, Nick.
Hey there. Thanks for having me, Marcus.
Great to have you, Nick. It's great to see you and have you here. Nick will talk about working from home. Will it persist, and to what extent will it persist, and to what extent we can forecast already how our lives will look like after COVID. So before we go to Nick, I would like to give some introductory remarks, some thoughts, and announce the poll results. Let me start what working from home will mean. So of course, there's a trade-off. We have, on the one hand, it's a good thing. We have less commute, but we also have less meetings in offices, less small talk on information sharing. But one thing I would like to focus on today is the QWERTY problem. And many of you probably know the QWERTY problem. Why are the keys on our keyboards assembled the same way with this QWERTY specification? And the reason, as you probably know, is that if you go back to the typewriter, it minimizes that the hammers smash. So you assign the letter such way that the hammers, which are most commonly together, are very far apart on the keyboard. But this, of course, now we don't use any typewriters of the old style anymore. But nevertheless, it's very hard to switch away from this design of the keyboard. And many generations have to learn using the keyboard the way we're using now, even though technology has moved on. So I would like to look at this, will we jump with the QWERTY? Is it, we are stuck essentially? Is the COVID shock a big enough shock that actually it's overcoming some QWERTY problems or not? And the way you think about the economy, it's not really a social planner implementing everything. It's very much a self-organizing dynamical system. So we have dynamical systems with different local basins. And there might be one basin here, might be a local minimum. I put here the welfare the other way around. So welfare is actually going down. So there's a local maximum and then there's a global maximum. And what COVID did for sure, and we have seen this in earlier webinars, it's a trend accelerator. So it makes the whole thing, the ball here coming down much faster. And one way to depict this, you have essentially a much steeper decline here. The ball speeds up much more quickly and you end up at this new local maximum much more quickly. But it could also be that COVID is actually leading to what I call a QWERTY jump, where you actually don't just go down to this local maximum much more quickly, but actually you go down and go beyond and you overcome this local maximum and we end up at the end, we end at the global maximum. So because, there's a lot of coordination has to be done and this COVID shock might have been big enough to lead us to a different basin of attraction. And, that's another, you can view it as an evolutionary stable system if you think of terms of evolutionary perspective. And the danger is a little bit that we do some policy interventions to minimize the impact, and then we might end up in this local maximum rather than in the global maximum. So that's how we have to think about these things. And there will be a big shakeup, but of course, working from home also has huge disadvantages because all the small talk, meeting with our colleagues in the office and during the coffee break or wherever, new ideas come. And you don't call up somebody via Zoom or with the phone, just say, oh, I might have thought about this idea, but you bump into people and that's probably missing. So that's, I think, also an econometric challenge, to what extent, I think it's interesting, I don't know, perhaps there is already some econometric methods, to what extent we have a regular speeding up or to what extent we have is a shock large enough. It's highly nonlinear and path dependent, leading to a different ultimate outcome which we haven't experienced. Would have not experienced without the COVID shock. So the other issue I would like to raise is a little bit, what are the implications of this home office phenomenon on traffic patterns? Will we have less rush hours? It eases up situations there because we have to rethink our whole physical transportation network to some extent, or is this over-exaggerated? Will it then even have implications on climate change? So we have less traffic, we might have less office space, and there might be a 1 to 2 year window where we can actually make implementations such that the change is actually sticking, the good change is sticking, the bad change is not coming. and there's some elasticity to change. Right now, the elasticity is very sensitive, so is very high, so we can do some changes, which we in 1 or 2 years, we probably cannot do anymore. And to what extent we use the window, to what extent we want to bring people back into the office, because the soft information flow is the most important one. And I don't have the answer for that, but probably Nick has, and we are curious to get his perspective. What's about real estate prices? Will that change a lot? Will living in suburbia be much more attractive than living in downtown New York City, in Manhattan? Or what happens with office real estate if we don't need so many offices anymore? We only meet once a week, on Fridays or particular days. And will we redesign our office space altogether, given the light of home working from home? But it even has other implications as well, and perhaps Nick can illuminate on us this too. It has implications on marriage and couples, in a sense that we don't need to have long distance relationships anymore, because you can work from home. So nobody has to be on the East Coast, on the West Coast. When I did my PhD, I was in London. My wife was in the US already. So they had a long distance relationship, might be working out much more easily. It might also ease up gender equality issues. So you see this gentleman here helping his son with the home office in front of the laptop. So perhaps it's a step towards gender equality. And given that we don't have so many long distance relationships, there might be even more kids down the road, because it's easier to handle kids if you work from home to somehow. But there are many, many implications. And I'm curious to get some answers in this direction. So going to some data, I got this from Thorsten Slock. You see that actually, so full-time, you see, and part-time, the blue one is part-time. You see full-time is much more home office for full-time employees. And it's actually going down already from May, June. So it actually was much more pronounced in May than it is already now. So it's about 23% altogether. In terms of which industries, that's from a McKinsey report I found, is like, finance and insurance and management is very, very high up there. But what I found most interesting from this McKinsey report is to what extent we will get a hybrid feature where we work a few days at home and few days in the office, and how this will play out. And the argument in this article was at least that it depends how advanced the economy is. So if you look at some advanced economies, Germany, UK, and US, then it will be actually very much a hybrid solution, and it will be leaning towards more to the home office. While if you have less advanced economies, then actually the home office component will be less pronounced, because also the type of work which is mostly done is less suitable for a home office arrangement. So with this little summary, let me go to Nick's poll results. So what did Nick ask us to find out is, before COVID, how often did you work a full paid day from home? And 10%, 50% never or rarely, so half of it, roughly half, 37% said 1 or 2 days per week. So you see that already some academics, most of the audience are academics and professors. So they work some part at home. 3 to 4 days a week, 7%, and full-time 6%. So it's a high number. But how is it now after COVID? What do you think it will be after COVID? The numbers are 20, 30, 20, and 30%, which are way higher. No comparison to before, even though the numbers I thought was already compared to average numbers, you will tell us later on, I think it's pretty high. And but it will be very persistent, at least what people think. And that might actually change the dynamics in the office space quite dramatically. And what's about social distancing? Will people return to the pre-COVID activities, or will just tilt to make a little bit like pre-COVID, but a little bit subdued way? So the answers were 40%, 30%, 20%, and 10%. So 10% of them, there's no return to pre-COVID activities. It was below 10%, so I just rounded it up to 10%. But you can see, so you see a change in patterns here as well. So with this, I pass the floor on to Nick, who will illuminate us how we will work together in the next decade.
Okay, thanks very much, Markus. Lovely to be here. I should start out by saying, I'm actually working from home. You can probably see, much like most people. I'm not going to share the data today, actually, but we know that only 49% of Americans currently are working in their own room, which is not their bedroom. So I'm in that minority. This is actually a spare room. That's where my mother-in-law from Scotland, who normally stays. So I have like a big bed. It's not the best environment, but I know I'm in the lucky minority. Most people are basically sharing rooms or in their bedroom. So with that backdrop, I'm going to go to the slides and let's check this all works out. So I'm guessing you can see this?
Yes.
Great. So working from home, will it persist? As an academic, I should mention my co-authors, Jose Barrero and Steve Davis, is part of this research project. So, to set the scene, over the last 20 years, news on working from home is rising about 5% a year. So I with my team scraped Newsbank. It's a source of all US daily newspapers. Astoundingly, there's about 2,000 of them. There's loads of local and regional newspapers, and we just scraped it for the frequency of the word working from home or remote work. And, I stopped deliberately at January 2020. I'll show you the rest of that period onwards, but it's rising. It's not rising that fast, but it's rising about 5% a year. So it's doubling roughly every 13 years. And you can see a couple of spikes. One was Marissa Mayer. She banned working from home in February 2013, temporarily at Yahoo. I actually spoke to Marissa for about 45 minutes about a couple of months ago. So I'm happy to talk about that incident. It's actually very consistent with what's happening now. And then slightly more bizarrely, in August 2019, Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul were both working from home due to injuries. Mitch McConnell slipped and broke his shoulder. Rand Paul was assaulted by his neighbor, which I don't know what that says, but either way, that was before COVID. This is from February afterwards. Working from home newspaper coverage has completely exploded. So it's gone up 12,000%. So at its very peak in March, 1 in every 40 newspaper articles was about it. And I'm guessing many people are kind of fed up by this point of reading about working from home. So today I'm going to focus primarily on some data about what we know. So just as backdrop, let's start from before COVID. It was great to have had the pre-survey. As Markus said, this audience is overweight towards academics, college graduates, higher educated people. Not surprisingly, that was a larger share of people who pre-COVID worked from home. Here's the US population from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They ran a fantastic survey before the pandemic in 2017, 2018 on 10,000 working Americans. And, the two things to point out is one, before COVID, 85% of Americans never had a full-time paid day working from home. So I know a lot of people working, mornings and evenings, but the key thing as Markus was mentioning, commute and office spaces, full days at home. And of the 15% of people that did work from home, you notice that only 2% were 5 days a week. So what I'm guessing many people listening are doing, either working or studying from home full-time. It's actually really rare before the pandemic. During COVID, this has surged. So I'm going to repeatedly draw from this survey. This is a survey I've been running with Steve Davis and Jose Barrero, which has sampled 2,500 Americans a month that are aged 20 to 64 that earned $20,000 or more last year. So that's important to highlight. These are people who I would say have a strong attachment to the labor force. Basically, last year, they were working full time. So you probably expect them to be working full time this year. This is why these numbers are slightly higher than the ones Markus showed that includes, there's different ways you can calculate it, whether you include people that are part-time. But anyway, this is full-time employees. What you see here is in May 2020, work from home share surged full-time to 42%, which is huge. That is a 20-fold increase in what we saw before the pandemic. You notice not working is down. That's the impact of the recession. On the right, this is November. Working from home has dropped, but it's not massively, and it's still an extremely high share. So working from home has been, remained stubbornly high. And in fact, the November number was up on October. So I'll show you in a minute, but because of the second wave and, in California, for example, we just got into not just a lockdown, but a curfew and not allowed out of the house after 10 p.m. Working from home is actually rising again in the US. And this has left commercial buildings semi-deserted. If anyone's ever watched, Z Wars or, The Walking Dead or any of those movies of, deserted city centers, you should drive around the center of Manhattan or San Francisco. So this is data from swipe cards from a company called Castle Security on thousands and thousands of swipe cards. And you can see here that office swipe in and swipe out is massively down. So San Francisco, near where I live, is one of the lowest, actually. It's at 10%. You know, everyone I talk to in San Francisco says it's like a ghost town. Basically, people are working from home, and a lot of people have just left, have gone up to Tahoe or gone to their parent, you know, that they're just not in town. So, you know, working from home, I'm generally positive on it, but I want to be very clear. And I noticed one of the comments asked Markus about, you know, for working women with kids, working from home has definitely generated a bunch of challenges. So on the left and the middle are two photos of students of mine. Students I've been having, you know, Zoom calls with, and I've noticed weird stuff in the background and been asking, like, where on earth are you? And, you know, to tell you where it is, Scarlett on the left was in the mornings, she gets the walk-in wardrobe. So she gets the clothes closet, and in the afternoons, her husband switches out with her, basically because the sound is too bad. They're both on Zoom calls. In the middle is Nikhil. He was in his girlfriend's walk-in wardrobe. And, you know, Nikhil, I was talking to him and I could see this like shirt hanging behind his ear. And I was like, Nikhil, where are you? And, you know, it all comes out. He's in a windowless room. And then on the right, I have 4 kids. This is my youngest, Catherine, who's 5, who just turned 5, actually. She was 4 at the start of the pandemic, who's very sweet. And it's, you know, as anyone knows with kids, it's very hard to resist your kids coming in. They're all on Zoom school right now because school in California is canceled or pretty much canceled. So, you know, for anyone with kids, it's just like a massive distraction. And in fact, my favorite anecdote, hilariously, is I was talking to somebody who said their husband Zoomed from the crawl space, which I was like, how can that even be possible? And she said, oh, he gets down there and it's basically the only quiet place in the house with the kids, and he lies down. So I actually tested it out. So here's me trying to, you know, I just basically took a Zoom selfie. I'm actually lying on the floor and looking up. It's possible, although I have to say it was extremely uncomfortable. So I wouldn't advise trying it, but it tells you to what extent people have gone to desperate extent. So when I talk about working from home under Zoom, I want to be clear. It's pretty awful now. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because we're all living it, but you know, kids sharing rooms, flaky broadband, etc. I'm really going to focus on what people are doing now and talk primarily about the future. So in terms of the future, there's, you know, right now, little consensus, at least in the media, apparently, on whether working from home works. So here's Reed Hastings of Netflix. He's very negative. He says, I don't see any positives. Not being able to get together in person, particularly internationally, is a pure negative. Interestingly enough, in that interview, he goes on to say, after COVID, we'll be probably working from home 1 or 2 days a week. So even, you know, Netflix and Reed Hastings, who's particularly negative, concedes, you know, coming back to what Markus said and coming back to the poll, in fact, most people post-pandemic see themselves doing a mixed mode. So as I come on to later, it's by far the most common story we hear is firms saying we're going to be in the office Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. We're going to be together. We're going to have all our meetings and events and trainings, etc. Let's say Wednesday, Friday are at home. And Netflix, you know, oddly enough, despite Reed Hastings' negativity, fits into that. On the very positive end, Hayward Donegan, the CEO of Rite Aid, I put her up because Rite Aid is a massive bricks and mortar, you know, retail there, a massive pharmacy that's right across the US. I think they're the second or the largest US pharmacy. I know it's interesting she's so positive on working from home, despite the fact that they're primarily an offline business. So what do we know? I'm going to talk about the survey I've been running. It's an ongoing survey. It's run monthly surveys. So I'll show you that, including the most recent data from actually a few days ago. The future of working from home and why we think it will stick. And then I end with some implications, as Markus kind of got to, you know, some tips on where to and where not to buy property. You know, I mean, do not right now, you know, the very center of big cities like Manhattan and San Francisco are in meltdown, but the suburbs are actually doing pretty well, and some other discussions about time use and commuting. So we've been running a monthly survey of 2,500 Americans. They're aged 20 to 64, and they earned $20,000 or more last year. So you basically want people that last year were working full time. You know, there's very few people I know from the CPS. There's almost nobody that earns $20,000 a year part-time. So they're working last year full time. And what were they doing this year? And we're doing this once a month. And in August, we had a double wave just doing boost sample size. So here's the type of thing it looks like. It looks very much like the poll you did at the beginning of the webinar. You know, it's a bit of bolding and highlighting, but basically it's, you know, it's a pretty standard online internet survey. So here's our respondent panel. People are rewarded for taking part in the survey, and you should always be slightly nervous about, you know, who's filling in these surveys. It turns out they look pretty representative on observables of the US population. So I'm not going to spend a long time going through it. We compare it to the current population survey, and indeed we actually are going to reweight on earnings, industry, and region to match the CPS. But even the unweighted data isn't that different. We're slightly overweight and higher earners, underweight and lower earners. Maybe that's good if you want to think about GDP. But, you know, surprisingly matches. And in the bottom row, this is stuff we don't even reweight. And in fact, it aligns pretty closely. So I don't want to have a long discussion about internet surveys, there's ups and downsides, but at least on observables, it actually looks pretty good, pretty close to the US population. So what's the current state of working from home? So as I mentioned, there's a huge increase. There are various ways of measuring this. And for this graph, I'm going to take a slightly different measure, which is the share of paid days working from home. So on average, how many days, what percentage of days you're working full-time at home, where, you know, 20% here would be 1 day a week. So how do we estimate that pre-COVID? We take that original bar chart I showed you from the American Time Use Survey, and we take the 2% of people that are full-time, that's obviously 2% of days, plus 0.4 of the people that said 4 days a week, plus 0.8, plus 0.6 of 3 days a week, etc. And before COVID, you figure out 5% of working days in America will work from home, 95% on business premises. If you go to May, that number jumps to above 60%. So that's obviously a massive increase, 16-fold increase on working from home share of days. Partly it's because a lot of people that are lower earnings, lower educated lost their jobs, but primarily it's because, you know, people that were still in work migrated home. You can see it's dropping, and most interestingly, in the recent wave, it's back up again, and that matches actually the data from the castle I showed you on residential, on commercial property occupancy, and it's part of the second wave of lockdown. So working from home right now is going through, you know, a local rise again. One important thing to note is working from home has a massive variation by education, and there's a long, you know, prior literature on this well, not long, but there's certainly an active prior literature going back at least to Dingle and Neiman, Bartik, Blick, and various others. So the basic idea is, if you think of the types of people that have less than a high school degree, these are people that left school probably at, you know, 14, 15, 16. They are generally doing manual jobs. They may be working in shops, in factories, outside work. And so it's very hard for them to work from home. If you flip it to the other end, go right down to the bottom, look at people with a graduate degree. So PhD, MBA, JD, etc. Them and, you know, college grads have a much higher share of working from home because the types of jobs they do are much more likely professional, business services, you know, managers that can be done working from home. So I'll come back to this later, but this is a pretty critical point. And I should say, I'm showing you survey data, but since the beginning of lockdown, you know, I've been working on working from home going back a decade now. So it was already a research interest. And since the beginning of lockdown, it's like exploded. And I must have done, you know, I don't know how many different firms I've spoken to. I've done bits of consulting, exec ed, spoken to a lot of journalists. In fact, spoken to multiple parts of Stanford, spoke to our local city, Palo Alto, earlier this week. So, you know, I've just heard anecdotally this over and over again. And it's kind of the same story you hear, that managers talk about this two-tier system whereby higher, you know, educated, more senior employees, better paid employees have basically got to work from home. Lower educated employees, lower paid, have basically either had to stick on the business premises, or actually a lot of them have lost their jobs. So I'll come back to this, but inequality is definitely a flavor of what's going on with working from home.
Nick, can I ask you a question? So Brian Richter would like to know, you know, working from home, how does it affect your career trajectories? Do you get less promoted? Is it dangerous if you work from home, that you're not seen in the office, you might be overlooked by promotions or something? Do you have any take on that?
Great question. So I give you an answer. I don't have an answer for COVID. I have a very precise answer. I actually have a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics on a randomized controlled trial in China that I'll briefly describe later, but I'll overview it now. So what we did, we took a C-Trip, which is now called Trip.com. It's China's largest travel agency. And at the time we did it in 2010 was worth, I don't know, $5-6 billion on NASDAQ. It's a massive company. And their CEO, I knew, James Liang, and they wanted to reduce their office space in Shanghai because it's so expensive. So they were looking into working from home, and we came up with basically a big randomized control trial. So they asked 1,000 people who wanted to work from home 4 out of 5 days a week. Interesting enough, only 500 people volunteered. So half of them volunteered. None of them we randomized by even and odd birthdays. So they literally drew a ping pong ball out of an urn and it said even. So people with even birthdays worked from home for 4 days a week for the next 9 months. And then we followed them for a further year and a half after that. And odd just stayed in the office. What did we find? Well, to show you later, people working from home are massively more productive. These were people making telephone calls, taking bookings, doing kind of clerical work. They were 13% more productive, primarily because it was quieter and actually worked more minutes in their shift. But on your promotion question, we saw that despite that, their promotion rate almost halved. So it's like a massive drop in promotion to people working from home. And from the kind of focus group interviews, the two issues that came up a lot were, one is being overlooked, out of sight, out of mind. And then the other thing was the managers honestly back in the office would say the people working from home are not developing as much managerial capital, or the lunches and coffee breaks they're missing out on are important. Now, that's before. Under COVID, things are very different because, of course, everyone is working from home. So that's really no guide to what's happening now. Post-COVID, as I'll come on to in a bit, this is a huge policy HR question for firms, because it turns out some people really want to work from home 5 days a week and some don't want to do it at all. My advice for managers has been offer something in the middle, like 2 days a week, and try and get everyone to do that. And the reason is this promotion penalty, because what you see in the data is certain demographics, actually religious groups, ages, people with and without kids, have more or less preference for working from home. And what you don't want to see is post-COVID, let's say, I don't know, people with young kids all decide to work from home, and then 5 years later you discover none of them have been promoted, or people that are very religious or something like that. You could open yourselves up for a serious issue around diversity and discrimination. So there is a promotion cost of working from home, but it seems to be driven by being there basically 4 or 5 days a week where everyone else is in the office. I think if everyone is at home 2 days a week and everyone is in the office 3 days a week, obviously there isn't really an issue.
So I have two more questions coming from the audience. One is about your survey by Bing Bing Dong. He would like to know, is there bias because more educated people are more likely to respond to the survey or not? And Kristen Walker would like to know, how does it compare to other countries in Europe, for example? Your survey, is US similar to Europe, or is other countries very different? And how does it compare to less affected countries of COVID? Can you look?
Great. Yeah, so in reverse order, I actually have a very detailed survey in the UK. It looks very similar to the I mean, you can hear I'm British, I hope. You don't think I'm Australian. I don't know, I've been here long enough. I even struggle with Brits and Aussies and Kiwi and New Zealanders. But the UK and the US and Northern Europe looks reasonably similar. As you go into continental Europe, even Germany and Southern Europe, working from home rates are a bit lower. There's a survey, I can't remember who ran it. I think it was Morgan Stanley. But there's still that, the increases are massive. It's just not quite as high as in the US and the UK, but rather than being, I don't know, 45%, they're more like 30%, but they're very, very high. And I was giving a talk in Singapore. I pulled up Singaporean data about a month ago. That's very high. Japan, I know, is high. So globally, there's been a big increase. The one international difference you do see, and I've seen work from the World Bank on this, is in quite poor, as in developing countries, the increase has been much lower, in part driven by the lack of infrastructure. So I talked to an exec who said they had a lot of workers in Indonesia and they couldn't really have them work from home because they didn't have broadband at their houses or computer equipment, and they were trying to install it. But that has turned out to be a big issue. So if you go to, say, Africa, shares of working from home are far lower because people just literally cannot work from home. But yes, for Northern Europe, it's similar. From Southern Europe, it's a milder version. And then on bias, survey bias, it's again a very important point. Interesting enough, we've been looking into this for some time, and there's a whole literature on survey bias on this. Like Evan Starr has various papers on this. You'd think initially that maybe you overrepresent undereducated, lower earning people, because who takes these surveys in the first place? It turns out the way that they run these polls is they get people that partly paid by cash, some people by air miles, they tend to be more educated, some people by in-game credits. It turns out, for better or worse, it kind of matches the current population survey. It's not precise. We can reweight based on observables. We've rechecked other numbers like employment numbers or location numbers or other earnings numbers, and they seem to align pretty well. So I don't want to claim it's perfect, but these online surveys, I give them kind of 7 or 8 out of 10. And as I go through the numbers, you'll see they match with other surveys and kind of common sense. So something wacky coming from an online survey I'd be nervous about, but nothing here in many ways is that surprising by the time you've spoken to that many managers. So I think they're pretty good, but I don't want to claim they're perfect.
Just a quick follow-up. If we had a COVID crisis 10 years ago, can you speculate, would it have been very different working from home?
Yeah, so this is, I'd say the question I've come from execs over and over again. I mean, I even spoke to like Eric Yuan from Zoom. I mean, there's like amazing number of people speaking to you very directly, and people at Microsoft and Amazon and Facebook, etc. So the question that always comes up now is why on earth we didn't do this before? Like, as I show you, working from home as post-COVID would be a big uplift, 2 days a week versus before, and it's very positive. And the answer is we could have done this 10 years ago. If you think of the technologies we need, they're broadband, cheap laptops, basically email, video calls, and cloud, like Dropbox type stuff. And the last of those was really, Skype video calls was the early. Skype came out in 2003. By 2005, 6 was widespread. I joined Stanford in 2005 and I could already Skype my parents and my kids. And Dropbox was probably the last cloud storage, but that was like 2010. So 10 years ago, we could have done it. 20, 30 years ago, it would have been a challenge. But yeah, for the last decade, it's been possible. And this is exactly Markus's QWERTY keyboard. And I come back to this. Another good example is like, why on earth we have these 3-month summer holidays for our kids? That's because they used to be let out to harvest the fields 100 years ago. But, I don't know anyone's kids that's harvesting over the summer, but including universities. I mean, no Stanford undergrad is harvesting the fields in the summer, but we still close down for 3 months. So that's, Markus's QWERTY. Working from home is the same. And I think it will, as I'm going to argue, it's going to be a permanent shift. But we could have done this 5-10 years ago.
Okay, I'll let you go on for more questions, but I have to let you go on too.
Yeah, so this is education. This is politics. Quite interestingly, if you break it up by red and blue states, you notice that early on blue states had a substantially and very statistically significantly higher share of working from home. By November, red states are above. My reading of this on the right is while red states have a lower level of regulation, there's less lockdown, people are scared. I mean, in the red states, you've seen the infection rates are absolutely astronomical. And I think people are voting with their feet and just refusing to go into the office. So whatever their individual politics are, the majority of people seem to figure out that working from home is a way to avoid getting infected in a very high infection area. So what about the future? So just to come back, people are very different about their views of working from home. So we asked people post-COVID, how many days a week would you like to work from home? I totally understand that now it's driven by county regulations. Like we have no choice. I'm in Santa Clara County. You have to work from home basically, unless you're a central service worker. We asked people post-COVID when you can choose, and this is of people who can work from home. So it's not, people, it's impossible for them. You notice there's an enormous spread. So 11% of people, mainly young single people living in small apartments, like I never want to work from home. Who'd want to spend even more time in your bedroom or your tiny living room, up to people who tend to be older, married with kids, living in houses that, I guess very much like my demographic, or they're not me personally, but want to work from home 5 days a week. And I'm kind of personally somewhere in the middle. I like seeing my colleagues. I like being in the office, but I'd also like to have a couple of days a week to kind of peacefully work. And so that turns out that's kind of typical for the average American employee, but it's worth noting there is a big variation. What about what we're planning to see? So I've added one more point here, which is the forecast. We asked people, what is your firm planning to do? And somewhat conservatively, they don't say in this, we assume none, but you could change that. We have similar data from directly surveying firms. It kind of gives a similar story, which is basically post-COVID, something like 25% of working days will be at home. So where does that number come from? Well, you can think about it very simply as the US labor force is roughly broken into half. 50% of people cannot easily work from home at all. They tend to do retail jobs or manufacturing jobs or jobs that you need to, like an airline pilot, you have to go into the premises. The other 50% of people do jobs that are reasonably amenable to working from home at least 2 or 3 days a week. And for that second group, almost all firms report that they will allow their employees post-COVID to work from home, typically 2-3 days a week. So half of the workforce is going to get to work from home half of the time post-COVID. And that's generating a drop because roughly now half of the workforce is basically working from home full-time. So, in economic language, most of the adjustments on the intensive margin, mostly it's people working from home less days rather than many people giving up entirely working from home. And as I'll come back to, I think this is very positive. Most people appear happier, firms appear more productive if you're all in the office, say Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and working from home Wednesday, Friday.
Can I ask a quick
Yeah,
question?
sure.
So several questions here. One by Paul Mitzen, he would like to know, are the jobs which are more working from home, they're also more exposed to automation? Is there some correlation there? Have you looked at that? Then Charles Whiplush would like to know, do you think this working from home will be imposed or is voluntary? Or is it the social norm which imposes it on the people? Do you have a sense on that?
Great question.
A comment saying that for women, it's actually quite hard. And there's some study coming out of Germany, Bridget Young, arguing that in terms of number of papers submitted and published, I guess submitted it must be, is negative for women in Germany, at least at the moment.
That's under COVID.
Working from home.
That's under COVID, by the way.
Under COVID, yes.
Yeah. So, hey, Charles. So on reversing, yeah, under COVID, to be clear, is pretty horrible circumstances, and I think it's not gender neutral. I think it's, what's the word? She facto childcare, I think, or I can't remember. I mean, basically, you see in the surveys that women end up de facto basically having to take more childcare when both. So I'm not really going to talk about under COVID, actually. I mean, it's pretty clear it's unequal and it's not great. So post-COVID, there's two schools of thought. One is there's a big variety of preferences, you let people choose. That's initially what I thought. But having talked to firms and looking at this promotion issue, the point that came up earlier, my view is increasingly, we should probably enforce the median view, which is kind of like minimizing loss squared. And the reason is I have a horrible fear about what will otherwise happen, which is seeing the study out in China. If you allow people to work from home 5 days a week that want to, they may not realize they're going to dramatically damage their promotion prospects. And 3 to 5 years down the road, you're going to find, I don't know, women with young kids are not getting promoted because they're at home. And so I think it makes more sense to honestly force people into the office, let's say Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and strongly suggest people work from home Wednesday, Friday. I think it's imperative the CEO and the senior management does, not necessarily the most junior people. As long as the managers aren't in, there isn't this head start on being in the office. But that's where most firms are going. And, if you want to get more complicated, if you're in an office space, you have a red week, blue week, the week after your team does Wednesday, Friday, and that way you can make better use of space. And it turns out that's quite a big deal because social distancing, as you saw from the poll, is not going to go away. So much like working from home, social distancing is partly going to stick. I mean, those poll numbers are very similar to what I find here. You notice only 40%, less than 40% of people said would entirely return to pre-COVID activities. So more than 60% of people are nervous of subways and elevators post, as am I to some extent. I'll come on to that. And then on the first question, automation. Yes, David Orto, I saw him talking at an event, had a great point. This is kind of turbocharged automation. He used to say, before the pandemic, you noticed in the US, there was very strong jobs growth actually at low end jobs. And it was, kind of people handing you your cappuccino with a smile in Starbucks. A lot of service sector jobs that were relatively low skill, but there was employment or, personal trainers, etc. The pandemic has been horrible for that because now we actually probably want under the pandemic, you want your coffee served by a robot because you're worried about infection. Post-pandemic, there's obviously a mixed outcome, but I actually think you're right. It is going to accelerate the motivation for automation. And as I come on to later, already we see a dramatic increase in innovation and patents around working from home. And my guess is someone else could do the study. You'd probably see it in automation. I guess if you looked at patents around automation, I suspect it's going to start surging up. So yeah, go ahead, Marcus. Happy to take another question.
No, it's fine. I'll let you I collect a few questions and then I'll throw it at you again.
So, I mentioned this, but firms basically have a similar view. From talking, I have a dynamic picture of Tim Cook here, our local, you sometimes seeing him in restaurants around Palo Alto. I haven't directly asked him about it. I don't want to bug the guy. It's a bit rude, but, he said in public, I mean, there's so many firms, Mark Zuckerberg, so many firms have said, we're going to go back post-COVID to probably be in the office 3 days a week and at home 2 days a week. So why will working from home stick? One is stigma. I gave a TEDx talk on working from home in 2017, and I did an image search of working from home, and you can see it's pretty awful. Pre-COVID, working from home just had a dreadful reputation. Look, I mean, if you look at the images, they're like naked people, people with babies. It's very, very negative. I actually use Bing because Bing gives up similar search terms, and the similar search terms are working from home comic, working from home funny, working from underwear. I mean, I don't know who's searching this stuff, but it's pretty clear. I used to work from home beforehand, and my friends always would say I'm shirking from home. So this stigma seems to have dramatically diminished. So in our survey, we asked people about the change in stigma, and it's clearly way down, as in people are much more positive on working from home. So that's I think, a pretty permanent change. Secondly, there's what in economics we call, the multi-arm bandit problem, in this case, the two-arm bandit problem. Before COVID, firms didn't know whether working from home would work, and it's expensive to test it out. So they just basically never tried. COVID has forced them to evaluate this. And two things have happened. One is some firms, just random variation, have discovered it's pretty good for them. They're likely to stick. That's the classic bandit thing. Experimentation generates some inertia. But the second is, on average, their priors were wrong. It turns out not only is the variation, but on average, it's much, much better than they thought. And again, this has come out a lot. So relative expectations, working from home has been really positive. And this is another big driver. It turns out it's better and better for a lot of firms. You notice for only 10% roughly, or 12% of firms say it's actually worse than they thought.
So Robert Owen would like to know, that's the actual performance, what's about a perceived quality of work for the workers? Is there a discrepancy, or have you measured that as well? Or?
There's a few studies. So there's the study I did back in the day, back in 2010 in China, where I saw 13%. That's very, very accurately measured. That's very precise, but it's and it's causal because it's an RCT, but it's quite a narrow measure. There's a lot more stuff that's come out now. I'll show you surveys we have and others. I saw something the other day on a big multinational. There's a job market paper by Emma Harrington and Natalia Emanuel that looks at a big US multinational. Mostly these things find a similar thing, that productivity is up. The slightly tricky thing is A, measuring that, and B, measuring it under COVID, because COVID is honestly a pretty crap version of working from home. So what we really care about is post-COVID. So my view is, coming back to what you said at the beginning, 2-3 days a week at home is positive, 5 days a week is negative because of this problem about innovation and creativity and water cooler discussion. So it looks like 2-3 days a week is way up. Our numbers suggest I'll come on to the end, but it's kind of like 5% productivity bump.
So I have a whole host of questions from the audience concerning supervision, how the monitoring will work. Is it a problem? Do we have to rethink the whole, more output focused rather than input focused guidance or supervision, or no supervision, just see what's the output you get at the end, rather than saying, how many hours did you spend at the workplace?
Okay, that's a great question. This is like Quentin Tarantino movie. We're going to go right back to the beginning here. So this is exactly the Marissa Mayer Yahoo thing. So I actually interviewed Marissa. I don't know if people remember, but Marissa Mayer is the CEO of Yahoo. She was a superstar CEO. And the biggest press coverage she ever got was when there was a memo leaked from Yahoo banning working from home in 2013, which shows how controversial this thing was. And it hit the news. So I interviewed her about a month ago and spent, almost an hour talking to her. That was exactly this issue. So she said when she took over at Yahoo, she discovered that A, the performance evaluation system wasn't great. They had something like 6 CEOs in the last 5 years. They were struggling basically. And B, there was a lot of people working from full time. And precisely as you say, you can either evaluate people based on output. So like what I do, for me, that would be, let's say, teaching and research, or based on inputs. Am I physically sitting at my desk and apparently typing on the computer? Now, exactly as you say, if you're an output-based evaluation system, working from home is fine. It really hasn't been that much of an issue because you're still evaluating people based on the same stuff. You just kind of let them get on with it. If you're input-based evaluation, it's a nightmare. And in fact, these are the firms that have started to, some of them have gone to this surveillance software whereby you install it on laptops and it takes photos of what your screen is looking at, what you're typing. I mean, the worst, I spoke to a company that said some people, they connect to the webcam and they take photos of your face randomly to make sure, this stuff is so creepy, but that's not a great output. So the short answer is well-managed firms that had output-based evaluations have handled this very well. Badly managed firms that basically had input-based evaluation, or firms that couldn't use output for certain reasons, have struggled. And in fact, it highlights a lot that HR has become much more critical during, performance management during lockdown because of this. So it's been a huge spur to people adopting incentive management, monitoring systems, because it's the only way to manage people remote.
But you see a shift towards output measurement rather than input measurement in industry?
I do a lot of work on management. We were collecting data right now. I haven't measured it formally, anecdotally, from talking to lots of managers. I've probably spoken to like 50, 60 managers. Yes, this comes up quite a lot. It's a big issue. And it's basically painful if you didn't have this to put it in place now. But quite a lot of firms said they're kind of installing output-based management systems. The problem with installing it now is you don't have the baseline. That's the big challenge. So what you compare to what? And for people that do different jobs, you don't really have a prior, but if you have the prior data, you can extract from databases, fine, but a lot of people didn't measure stuff. So but yes, there are people moving in that direction. And for anyone that's managing anything, it's
Let me throw in another question from the audience. It's about, do you expect the team size within a company will be different? So certain teams are doing something together and they have to coordinate whether to work from home or not. Do we have the whole managerial structure? Do we have to rethink it now, or?
I don't know. Rafael Sadun, my co-author at HBS, Michael Imping, and some co-authors, I'm embarrassed I'm forgetting who else they are, but Rafael has done a lot of stuff on management work and CEOs. She has a survey looking at meetings, actually using Microsoft data, quite incredible data of millions of firms, and shows that at least in terms of Zoom, the number of people in the meetings is significantly higher. They're more frequent, but they last less time. And she, ponders whether that's a permanent shift. So it appears like we're meeting and also emailing more people. Now, it may be just because everyone CCs everyone, but for Zoom meetings, they're on the meeting or the Teams meeting. So possibly
one thought, I talked to one of my friends and he told me it makes a huge difference on Wall Street how many people can be participating in some negotiation. And you can learn from that because the client doesn't mind if there are 20 young guys also in the Zoom meeting. And in the olden days, they were never included in these important meetings.
It's a great point. I mean, for Princeton, I don't know if you do it for Stanford, we do practice interviews. And when I was running placement in Stanford about 5 years ago, I thought, why don't we get the students that are going on the market to sit in and observe other students practice interviews? We only had one of them per interview because you couldn't fit more in the professor's office. But on Zoom now, as many can show up, and it's a bit stressful for the person having the practice interview, but in some senses, it's a more lifelike test. So yeah, I think there's an enormous amount of stuff will change. I'm going to keep going for a run out, but yes, the firm is the structure of the firm will definitely change. I think it's a fascinating research area. So false expectation. The third thing is just investment. It seems kind of obvious, but people have spent on average about $600 equipping their office. I'm standing up because I bought a standing desk after one particularly grueling day of Zoom. I got like horrible knee ache from crossing my legs. So now I tried to stand up. So, if you want, I can lower my desk or raise it like this, it's quite cool. But on average, the average American spent $600. They spent 13 hours getting up to speed on Zoom, getting stuff set up, or Teams or whatever you use, WebEx. If you calculate that's about 1.2% of GDP, that's a lot of money actually investing on this, which is mostly sunk. That's from the household side. That's mostly non-overlapping of what firms report, because most of that household expenditure, even if it's expense, does not get recorded as capital expenditure by firms. So there's another similar chunk. If you look at investment in the US, it's fallen except in one category, this information processing equipment and software. So firms have also spent a lot. So there's a huge amount of capital investment. Fourth, this is the original sneeze video. I'm sure everyone has seen loads of these horrific sneeze videos. So this is actually the paper from PLOS one, which actually did the first ever high-speed video. This was their thing, a new methodology for studying the dynamics of aerosol particles. I put this up because I'd never seen this before, and I doubt anyone else had. But suddenly, post-COVID, we've all watched dozens of these horrifying sneeze videos. And it kind of highlights how we're much more aware of stuff in, viruses and particles in the air. And this is the survey we did. It actually turns out to align incredibly closely with the one we did at the beginning of this webinar, which is the majority of people say they're nervous, even post-COVID, when there's a vaccine, for doing things like subways, crowded air elevators. I mean, we got a very similar number. Slightly more people confident and slightly less would not continue to socially distance. And I know this number in our survey, people that are less educated report being more nervous. So it's completely aligns with this audience. But you can see that most people are still nervous about being in high proximity. And as a result, when you talk to firms, they are not planning the same density post-COVID as pre. So it means office, they need more office space to house a given number of people. And then finally, the final factor is what I'm going to call redirected or directed technical change. We just scrape patents from the US Patent and Trademark Office. And here's the share of patents that mention working from home, remote work, working remotely. And it takes a while for these things to be published. We only have data that's reliable up to July. We've dealt with various censoring issues, but you can see, not surprisingly, this is exploding. From talking to firms, a lot of high-tech firms are putting a lot of effort into developing technologies because the market's dramatically increased. So working from home technology will improve. So this is Marcus, your QWERTY jump at the end. There's these 5 drivers, and overarching this is these kind of network effects. So I want to end on saying implications. So one is, I'm going to call it, it's an uneven effect. You could think of it as inequality, although it's a good thing, but it's just that good thing is not going to everyone. So I asked people how much you value working from, how much would you value working from home 2 days a week post-COVID? And the average answer is about 8% of salary, and in fact matches the numbers from Mass and Pillay. Alex Mass is at Princeton and Mandy Pillay at Harvard's AR paper looking at this 3-4 years ago. So it's clear that people value this as a very important perk. It turns out if you look at who's going to get it versus who wants it. So on the x-axis here is annual earnings of our survey respondents in 2019. On the y-axis in the black circles is how much people want to work from home post-pandemic. You notice on average it's about 40%, so typically 2 to 2.5 days a week is very flat across the earnings. In red is how much they say their employers are planning for them to do. You notice it's very upward sloping. It tells you there's a massive gap at the lower income levels. These people really want to work from home as much as everyone else. They're just not going to get it. So this is a big issue around working from home and inequality. Second issue are cities. So it turns out working from home, not surprisingly, is far higher right now from people that used to work in city offices. And at the bottom, I put my 4 previous employers before Stanford, which are classic examples of this: the LSE, McKinsey, the Treasury, which is the UK Finance Ministry, and on the bottom right, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So there's like a massive outpouring of people from city offices in particular to home. And what does that do? Well, we calculate as one example from Manhattan. Post-COVID, that's going to drop retail expenditure in Manhattan by about 10% a year, because you know how much people, commuters spend per day in Manhattan. It's actually quite a lot on food and drink and shopping. And you work out how many days a week they're going to be there. So that's a pretty substantial drop. It's obviously far more now because working from home is much higher now, but future we predict about 10%. So this is an issue for retail for the center of cities. There's also an issue for commercial property. So I have a survey that shows post-COVID, this is with the Atlanta Fed in Chicago, post-COVID, the demand for office space is about flat. So this sounds really surprising. How could this be? And the answer is, while there's something like, we're going to go from 5 to 25% of working days home. So obviously there's roughly a 20% reduction in footfall into the office. There's almost a perfectly offsetting increase in the demand for space per person. So this is the residual effect of social distancing. As a result, the square footage demand for companies is roughly flat. Actually, when you survey them, you surveyed around 500 companies, but there's a massive shift from skyscrapers to office parks. So building on the left is a Salesforce tower. I actually spoke to a firm that works there, pretty well-known firm. They have a few floors, and they said they haven't been in since March. You can't get to the front door because you can't take mass transit and social distancing. It's very hard to get on the subway. And then how do you get up to like floor 40 in these elevators? So, there is a serious issue with skyscrapers and tall buildings, even post-COVID. And it's leading to what's been called the donut effect. So you see it around here. The center of San Francisco, the central business district, is really suffering. Rents for residential properties down about 25%. The suburbs have actually done really well and are up. So there's kind of a movement. People are seeing they're going to be working from home 2-3 days a week. They don't want to live right in the center as much. They just want a bit more space and move further out. So very much the center of cities are struggling, and the suburbs seem to be doing better. And personally, maybe that's a good thing. It reduces the affordability crisis in the center of cities. Thirdly, productivity. I mentioned this briefly. I'm going to skip. This is, the chart from my randomized control trial where we found productivity up. If you ask survey firms, they on general say working from home increases efficiency, although it's not uniform. And there's some clear issues over long run innovation, but mostly firms are positive on efficiency. So, we estimate it's going to potentially increase aggregate productivity post-COVID by 2 to 4%. And then I end by saying time use. The final thing is we wondered, what do Americans do with the 60 million hours a day they're saving from working from home? So there are about 60 million Americans working from home more now than before. They commute for about an hour a day. Turns out about 40% of that time they just spend working more on their primary job. The other 60% of their time is roughly split between production activities at home, other jobs, childcare, home improvements, and the rest goes on leisure. So I end, working from home it's going to stick, but it's not entirely going to stick. It, exploded. It was the majority of GDP was actually working from home at the peak of the shutdown, but it's way up, and it's Marcus's QWERTY. I think we're going to settle on a much better long-run equilibrium. Firms and workers are going to be happier with this on average. There's, various mechanisms for the persistent shift, and I think it has some quite serious implications actually for the US and international economies.
Thanks a lot, Nick. There are tons of questions, so I will just have time to pick a few of them. But so there's Roberto Appelfeld. He would like to know that if you look at intellectual artists and technology contributors, there would like to be in highly dense neighborhoods. Nevertheless, even if, would you, because you made very strong predictions, the donut effect, would you say there's something where there's some synergies anyway, and we want to like to be together and don't work so much from home after COVID? What would you respond to him essentially?
So two things. One is, I think being in the office 3 days a week, if you're an office worker or you work in, a factory, I don't want to assume everyone works in offices or universities. You probably, 3 days a week, the idea is you basically reorganize your tasks throughout the week. So those quiet readings and report writings, you shuffle across to Wednesday and Friday and Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. They'd be exhausting. They'd be like hyper social. And by the end of the day, you're like, I don't want to have any more meetings. But that way you have your 3 days, all your interaction time is basically the same amount of minutes. It's just on 3 days. Now, let's think about artists. For artists, it's a bit more eclectic as how they operate. The drop in the prices of residential real estate in city centers may help them. Richard Florida, I was listening to a podcast, said, it'd be lovely to go back to 2000 when artists could, bohemians could afford to live in, the center of New York, even in tiny apartments, and the big push back. So that may help that group. So I actually see generally it's a win-win. I don't want to say everyone's benefited, but net is mostly pretty positive.
So in terms of office design, have you thought about office design too? Because I have to share it in my office. It's not my office anymore because certain days somebody else will use it. Or we won't have walls anymore. We will anyway want to meet. It's all big, only cubicles, or even not cubicles. We don't have to do any typing. We just have big chat rooms where we all chat together and have meetings.
Yeah, so office design is one of those things that's tricky for firms because what's optimal now is completely the reverse of what's optimal later. So what's optimal now, a lot of firms are putting in these perspex screens and cubicles, trying to separate people apart. Post-pandemic, it's the reverse. So if you think about it, if you're in on work Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, you're there to meet people. So you're not really there to be in a little cubicle on your own. That own time is going to be at home. And so actually you want meeting rooms and presentation rooms and open plan areas. And sure, you may need a desk for 20 minutes between meetings, but basically the future offices, if this is true, will be much more collaborative space because that's what you come in for, and much less individual cubicles because if you're going to read reports and work quietly in your office or have one-on-one phone calls, you can just do that at home and just avoid the commute.
So another group of questions are, why is it on a daily basis? So we work, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or, 2 days a week we stay at home. Why not 3 weeks and then 1 week at home, or 3 weeks at home, 1 week in the office, or some other? Why is it at a daily basis? Is this the ideal thing? Especially if you were to live further away, we have to fly in or something. It might make sense to have a weekly. Do you think the whole industry will go to this daily routine, or it will be moving much more to? It will depend on the industry.
I think, again, it's an important question. It's one of those things that is a trade-off between harmonization across the firm and, choice. So my guess is most people, particularly people with kids, are not going to want to fly in. It's going to be, but I don't know. Some firms may go that way, and I have heard models of that. For example, there's someone called Christy Johnson that runs Artemis Consulting, and she's an ex-Stanford MBA. She's been doing it for many years. She's a friend of mine, and she has like 50 consultants. She's the CEO of it. And she says it was all remote. And before the pandemic, they used to fly to like Houston or Chicago for a couple of days once a month because they still needed some of that face-to-face time. So an alternative is flying in. My guess is the majority, but I don't know. It depends on company by company. We'll find it more convenient to come in 2 days a week for people that have, spouses and kids. And if that's the case, you want everyone coming in on the same day. So there may well be companies where they come in for a week and remote for 3 weeks. And I think that's fine, as long as whatever you do. The problem is you can't have some people do that and some come in 2 days a week because you get this, risk of discrimination of people left behind and forgotten about. So for small companies, they may just poll their workers, quite honestly, and decide to go with whatever. It's worth highlighting that's going to affect who you hire in future, of course. So if you fly in once a month, you can't hire anyone that really needs to, probably with young kids. I mean, I don't understand. It's hard to see how some of these things would work if you're particularly a single parent with small children. So.
David Ballard would like to know, have you studied what are the implications for labor force participation? So does it make it less or more likely for people to participate in the labor force?
Yeah, I haven't looked at it. People have raised it. I have an anecdote, but no more, which is long ago, I visited JetBlue, the airline out in Salt Lake City, or in 2010, actually, when I was doing the original work from home study. And JetBlue, I don't know if people realize, their call center was almost entirely manned by people working from home. And actually, I went out and visited the call center, but also the people working at home. And it turned out a lot of them were extremely educated Church of the Latter-day Saints adherents that basically had, a lot of kids. They were primarily women, actually, and they wanted to work from home because of childcare commitments. So that group, when you interviewed them, would not have gone into the office for 5 days a week. So the kind of stories we're seeing is they'd say, I get up, I work 6 till 7. My kids wake up, I take them to school. I then come back, I work during the school day. They then come back, I look after them, etc. So it turns out that flexi place, which is working from home, is quite often correlated to flexi time. Now, I don't want to, I'm aware under COVID, it's very different. The gender implications of COVID are pretty awful, but there are some people that basically maybe want to work part-time. Another group that's being benefited is disabled. I've spoken to a couple of people that have various disabilities, and for them, it's a big upside if it's hard to physically come into the office to be able to work from home. And it's important that other people are doing the same. So it's much more easier to work efficiently if you're, say, in a wheelchair, if you're at home, because it's harder to get in if everyone else is at home because you're on a level playing field.
So I have some final few questions, which is about, do you see the biggest breakthroughs coming now more on the technology side or more on the managerial side? What are the biggest challenges? Because I can also envision that we will later not sit in front of a screen in, in Zoom, but some virtual reality, which will be almost like being in the office. You set up some goggles and stuff like that. Do you see this, or is there any chatter among the managers that this is around the corner and this coming? Or do you think the biggest challenges are much more how we redesign the offices, how we restructure the teams, how we rotate the teams so they meet across teams, things like that? Or where do you see the biggest challenge and biggest breakthroughs in the future?
I mean, I should start by being humble. Economists, track record of predicting technology is dreadful. In fact, there was a computer scientist who had made that fantastic prediction in 1950, saying, well, I see, eventually we'll need 2 or 3 computers in the world. And it's like, unbelievably wrong. Or somebody in the 1800s said, all inventions are over, that's it. But my sense is in the short run, it's much more organizational and managerial, as you say, because these are massive social changes, and the technologies I've seen for working from home are getting better, but they're not radically changing. It doesn't feel dramatically different than it was 10 years ago, but society is massively changing, including the point one, my diminished stigma. That's been a huge issue. In fact, the Emanuel Harrington paper points out that if you looked, people that worked from home before COVID were more productive. The same person was more productive at home, but they were less productive individuals. So it's a weird thing. It was very negative selection. I heard this a lot, that you get told, look, if you want to get on in this company, you have to be in the office. And so you had very negative selection towards working from home. I feel that's gone, particularly for, people 2-3 days a week. And that's a massive change. And as the question on, will it affect labor force participation? I think it will in ways that I suspect it will be very positive, but it's slightly hard to tell. But I think there's a lot of people that will be attracted to working that weren't previously.
So let me end with a final question from Willy Semmler and Morris Kleiner. They both would like to know what are the implications for the trade unions in the wage bargaining, and what would you recommend some trade unions how to react to it? Will we see much more gig work relationships too? So once you shake up the managerial thing, we can also say let's move to a more gig arrangement anyway. If I go for output measures rather than input measures, how would you? If some head of the trade union comes to you and said, "I should have to think about that," what are the implications for us, and how should
That's a very interesting question. The way I see it in the long run is you're still in the office 3 days a week. So I don't see these disconnected relationships. So it's true that if it's entirely output-based, like gig working, that would be an issue. I think the big thing I would raise is that this is a very valuable perk. So both in our work and Mass and Play, you see that people value this we quite explicitly asked the question, how do you value it? And you allow people to say positive, negative, or neutral, and then give valuations. 8%, and various surveys have found similar things. So this is a perk that is about as valuable as something like a pension, or maybe, a somewhat stingy healthcare plan. And that's a lot. I mean, and it turns out actually it's more valuable for higher earners because they tend to live further away and have a nicer house. So you look at the numbers, they're more like 10 to 12%. So I would point out that I'm not sure this is a negotiating point, but it's clear that unions tend to represent more, on average, I think they're middle to lower income workers. That group, particularly manual workers, are going to not get this perk. And they've also suffered on average worse during the COVID crisis itself. And so it's worth noting. And I think this is going to be a politically important point. The Biden administration, I think, is they need to raise taxes. And, this will be one thing they'll point to, that this work from home and remote work has benefited the higher off. And so in some sense, maybe it's not as unreasonable they have a higher share of tax increase.
We have a tradition in this webinar series that we always end at a positive note, but overall, I think you're very positive. You're thinking we do the QWERTY jump in a much better outcome. Can you point to another positive element from that?
I mean, the three wins that people have raised, two are there. The third is less clear, but one is on individuals. So it's clear that individuals are massively happy. I mentioned this 8% average value, and that's from 2 days a week. That's a feasible thing rather than currently this weird, nasty COVID version. Firms are also, on average, going to be better off. They can probably save on given they're going to have a socially distant, they're going to save on real estate costs and actually have more productive employees. The productivity numbers are up.
And real estate cost this was a question too in the audience. Real estate is the biggest saving, no? What do you quantify? They're not. No,
I don't know. It's hard to.
You can pay lower wage rates because people are happy. I can push the wage rate down in a sense.
You could, yeah. So there's three costs in the CTRIP paper, and the QJ went through three savings. One is real estate, and it depends. That's dependent on where you are and how much you cram people up. The second is productivity. That was the second factor in Shanghai, but for other firms, for investment banks, that's probably the primary factor for high earners. And then the third is retention. So it's true you could cut the wages, or you could just see a much lower turnover rate because hiring and training people up is extremely costly. So for firms, it strikes me on average, certainly is clearly positive. The third benefit is in debate, by the way, is environmental. So on the one hand, it's clear we'll commute a lot less, which is good. But the issue that's been raised, particularly in northern cities, I mean, to some extent, Princeton, and I guess you go further north, is it's going to be much more heating of houses and air conditioning, and heating the winter air conditioning so much is far less efficient at home. So net is not clear how that will pan out, but air travel being down, air travel is way down because of this. This is definitely one benefit environmentally. So I think net is probably positive environmentally.
But I interrupted you at another.
No, that was it. I'm sorry. I wasn't very clear. I had individuals are happier, firms are more productive and happier, and hopefully the environment improves.
Who will be unhappy? Is there anybody about it?
Maybe people that love to go in and flirt in the office 5 days a week. I don't know. People that really want to be in the office 5 days a week, I think, won't be happy with having to work from home.
What about the bars in the working place where, especially in the UK, you always go to a bar for a drink at the end of the day?
You're right. Okay, that's a good point. Somebody just said Donald Trump would be unhappy, and I'd be very happy if Donald Trump is unhappy. But downtown bars and restaurants. Although with them, as an economist, you always think who's the residual claimant on that, and I just assume they're leases. So if you happen to own, commercial property, retail property in the center of cities like New York, you're unhappy. If you happen to rent it, your rent will just go down because no one else wants to use it, and so that should adjust. But yeah, if you own, I've talked to quite a lot of commercial property landlords, and those owning large skyscrapers in the center of big cities are a combination of unhappy and in denial. That's pretty horrible. If you looked at those occupancy rates, they're getting 20% occupancy rates. It's not going to go back to 100%. And so that's going to be a challenge for them. And the valuation of those buildings is down. It's quite substantially down, actually.
Now we have to get the corner with one more positive thing. Otherwise, we end it on a negative note.
Oh, one more positive. Wow, you're really pushing me here. One more positive thing. I thought, I
think we covered 3 positive, 1 negative. I think we're on balance. We won the game on the positive.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what else. I think, look, innovation on working from home will also be great, actually. For, I have a friend of mine that used to work from home always, and he said he's so happy that now everyone else is at home because it's so much easier for him to do his job, and all the facilities we've got. You know, just as an example, Teams by Microsoft at the beginning of the pandemic had only 4 windows you could use. By April, it had gone to 9, and now it's gone to 49. And I spoke to Microsoft, and not surprisingly, they have dumped a lot of resources into that. So, you know, innovation on working from home, those who are already working from home is way up. And Zoom is producing hardware, and there's all kinds of, you know, these virtual reality. I have another friend, Eddie Obang, that in the UK has this fantastic virtual reality meeting facility.
Cool. So a lot of exciting stuff coming up, and that's surely a boost for the whole innovation. Thanks a lot, Nick, and also for your innovation and for making this so lively and giving us all these perspectives and very, very great insights. Very much.
Great. Hey, thanks very much, Marcus. And I love your innovation of the Markus Academy. As we were talking before we went live, it's fantastic.
Okay, great. Good. Okay. Hope to see you in the real world too at some point again.
Exactly right. Okay, thanks very much.
Yes.